So, culturally competent lawyer, why? So I've been doing this work in a number of sectors, not just in law, but certainly in health and in education and in community service and in the retail sector, and with realtors, dental hygienists, doctors Nova Scotias, teachers, and nurses. I think that's the list. Cultural competence is a thing now. Would you agree with that? The language is even that language. And I think that there are a couple of reasons for that, generally and very specifically for lawyers. Okay? Generally, I think cultural competence is becoming a thing not because Canada is becoming more diverse. Okay? That's not the reason. Canada has always been diverse. North America has always been diverse. Cultural competence is becoming a thing because marginalized populations in North America are beginning to take their space in the society. Okay? So, and as they begin to take their space, their expectations and the broader community's expectations are that we better understand how to serve and meet the needs of diverse persons within Canadian society. Okay? So it's not like we're more diverse than we ever were. Here, certainly, we know about the historical immigrations that have occurred over the years, and so Halifax, Nova Scotia society, particularly in Halifax and in industrial Cape Breton, have always been very, very diverse. But that these folk now are taking up their space. And as a result of that, we're all having to manage that a little more specifically. It is interesting to note that if you look at the promotional material of most sectors, whether it's health, education, realtors, banking, you will see that there is a very particular marketing emphasis to non-white Canadians. Right? I had a multi-year project that was just a kind of a casual project. I bank at CIBC, and they used to have like a picture when you go online. There would be a picture representing the CIBC consumer, and I noticed that the pictures changed every day, and they kind of cycled through, and I just started taking a snapshot of those pictures, and then they stopped that, and now there's just a penguin or something. I don't know. But after they stopped using the pictures, I went into CIBC's and just started taking a copy of all of their brochures and cutting and pasting the images from those brochures. And you would see that CIBC is marketing heavily to diverse Canadians. They even had a great big poster in the branch where there are two individuals in an airport, right? Both persons who are non-white. And there was a caption under each person. One person, starting a business, another person starting their family in Canada, and some kind of language that let you know that CIBC is the place for you if you're doing either of these things. And so, of course, I wanted to take a picture of that to add it to my collection, and found out very quickly that it's not cool to take pictures in banks. What I'm saying is that it's shifting. And in law, there are some very clear examples of this shift. So one is that cultural competence is being read into the standards of professionalism. And I think it's Rose Voivodich who wrote that article in 2006 about lawyers meeting the social context, understanding cultural competence. Are people familiar with that article by Voivodich? Anyway, it was an article in which she advances this idea that cultural competence is a thing for lawyers because it is being written in law societies across the Canada. It's being read into standards of ethics and competence. So there's an increasing expectation on lawyers from their regulatory bodies that lawyers be culturally competent. I think that we've seen a number of cases in which the courts have said clearly that there's an expectation of certain knowledge and values related to race and culture on the persons who come before the court. Okay? So in the RVS case, for example, the Supreme Court, in discussing the reasonable person, made this comment. This is actually a quote from the decision. The reasonable person is cognizant of the racial dynamics in the local community, and as a member of the Canadian community, is supportive of the principles of equity. So the Supreme Court has actually read into the definition of reasonable person this concept of cultural competence. Does that make sense? Okay. There's also this case, which is still fairly controversial in Nova Scotia, the R.V. Fraser case, that on appeal, the question was, does a lack of cultural competence call the competence of a practicing lawyer into question? Right? I'm not going to go into the R.V. Fraser case because, as I mentioned earlier, I am not a lawyer. But Richard Devlin, professor of law here, has included an analysis of the R.V. Fraser decision in a piece of work that he has done recently. I'm not sure if that piece of work has been published yet. He was working on it when last he and I presented as part of a panel on this topic. So I'm afraid I don't have the exact reference for you there, but he's local and available and accessible. I do have a copy of the draft that he was preparing. And I just thought I would read a little bit from the opening paragraph of, I think, what is going to end up being a chapter in a book. In recent years, some have started to question whether we have a sufficiently inclusive conception of competence. The provisions of the model code are seen to be quite technical in nature. They do not do enough to address the deeply relational and highly contextual nature of the practice of law. Some commentators have begun to ask whether lawyers should also be required to be, quote, culturally competent. And again, he's referencing the Voivodich article, Rose Voivodich, Lawyers Meet the Social Context. Can lawyers give competent advice if they are not in tune with the cultural context of a client, he asks? There's nothing explicit in the model code to address this question. Some argue that cultural competence is implicit in Principle 1, integrity, and Principle 5.03, non-discrimination, of the model code. And then he asks the question, do you agree? I am going to answer the question and say, sure, you're right. And that's why the Schulich session today is on cultural competence. Because I think the answer has been made. The answer to the question has been made. And that there has been an increasing discussion of the concept of cultural competence as it applies to lawyers, not only in the Canadian literature, but throughout North America now. There was an article not that long ago in the, well, I guess it was a fair time ago, in 2008, in the Michigan Bar Journal, Beyond Bias, Cultural Competence as a Lawyer's Skill. And that's just one of countless examples of this discussion that is happening now in the practice of law.